you so much for joining me on Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. I'm your host, Dr. Carrie Kerr-McAvoy. I won't be posting the normal episode on Friday. I'm going to be taking the week off. My sister succumbed to an aggressive infection, and we are remembering her life this week as a family. So I'm going to honor her memory and take the week to stop and reflect on who she's been and what she's meant to me. But this drives home the travesty of narcissistic abuse. She was a victim of it for many, many years. It not only had psychological and emotional ramifications, it also physically affected her. Narcissistic abuse is a horrible tragedy. We need to do more to stop the harm that is inflicted on all of narcissistic abuse victims. So thank you for joining me today on this episode of Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. On these platforms, we talk a lot about narcissistic abuse, but have you ever slowed down to actually think about what we're talking about? We use these diagnoses, these definitions, as if instinctually that we all are on the same page and we're defining it the exact same levels in the same ways. And we even think that there's these rules that apply to it that are universal. I've heard some say that all narcissists, for example, cheat. Well, that's not the case. Not all of them do cheat. I've also heard that narcissists can never change. Well, maybe a little, but probably not enough to be significant for you and I. But we also have a lot of other kind of general assumptions. Like, for example, does all abuse qualify as narcissistic abuse? So what's different about narcissistic abuse from general abuse? For example, narcissistic abuse includes all forms of abuse, but just because all forms of abuse are there, does that make the person who's doing it narcissistically abusive? The answer actually is no. So I came across an interesting article, and that I would love to share with you that defines it. It was by Kristen Milstead, which particularly makes me very excited because I'm interviewing her on August 18th. There's going to be a live webinar. If you would like to go to that, that would be awesome for you to, if you want to check out. Those of you who are new to me, I'm Dr. Carrie Kerr-McAvoy. I am a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of counseling experience. These days, I primarily do education to create content, but I would love to take your questions. But I want to first take this definition. I find it fascinating. It's kind of a launching point before I take your questions. But if you'd like to ask me a question, please put it in the interact button. Please be aware that this is just a professional opinion, but it cannot constitute the same as counseling. It is important for all of you who are facing some kind of a very difficult situation that need help to please see a therapist for mental health support, definitely. For those of you who don't know, I wrote a book called About Narcissistic Abuse. I actually got trapped in a relationship with a narcissistic abusive person. Dr. Milstead did too. For those of you who just maybe missed the intro, Dr. Milstead wrote the book, Why Can't I Just Leave? She is a thinker, a critical thinker, and a researcher in narcissistic abuse. She's going to be interviewed by myself and a few other panelists, including Lisa Soni, Jules from Hearts with Jules, and Manjeet Rupai, as well as Bree, Abuse is Abuse. We're going to be interviewing her August 18th. It's a live webinar. And the last 30 minutes, you actually get to ask her your questions. So if that sounds something you'd be interested, please check out the link in my bio so that you can make sure you get tickets, because this is going to be a popular one. I am so excited, guys. She's also a narcissistic abuse survivor. Similar story to my own. If you get her book, Why Can't I Just Leave, which frankly, guys, I think this is the book. The book on narcissistic abuse is Why Can't I Just Leave? She explains what happens with narcissistic abusive situations, why we get trapped and stuck, what happens psychologically to the victim's mind that enables us to do more proactive care of ourselves. So please, if you want to understand what happened to you or why you're stuck, or even just to sort of retrospectively look back and try to make sense, because I know that's where I've spent a lot of time trying to make sense and get closure. So that's been one way that I've done this, is by doing a lot of research. And Dr. Kristen Milstead, I frankly say, in fact, let me find her book so I can show you what it looks like. I think she does a beautiful job. This book just came out in November. It is awesome. I highly, highly recommend it. It's called Why Can't I Just Leave? So she's going to be interviewed live on August 18th. The tickets in my bio. It's called "Why Can't I Just Leave?" I kept the title the same as the webinar's title, the same as the book. So one of the things that Dr. Milstead, and she wrote an article for Psych Central, and she proposed these tenets as definitions of narcissistic abuse. Because believe it or not, if you go out and look, what is narcissistic abuse? You're going to find that not everyone agrees. There's lots of varying definitions. It's actually quite vague and inconsistent. But she wrote these, she thinks these tenets are things that consistently defined narcissistic abuse. So I'd love to have you see what you think and let me know. She says narcissistic abuse is the intentional construction of a false perception of someone else's reality by an abuser for the purpose of controlling them. And it has the following features. 1, a false reality that's constructed through an elaborate covert deception and psychological manipulation over a long period of time. 2, the false perceptions created of the abuser are someone has the survivor. Let me start over. The false perceptions created are of the abuser as someone who has the survivor's best interest at heart, and the relationship is a beneficial one for the survivor. In other words, we see this person as instrumental in our life. They could be a family member, a coworker, a boss, romantic love. It could be a family member, like a parent or a child. It's somebody that we believe has our vested interest. The goal of the abuse is to allow the narcissist to extract whatever he or she perceives to be of value from the partner, including attention, admiration, status, love, sex, money, a place to stay, or other resources. 4, the abuser takes advantage of societal norms that assumes everyone participates in social relationships with a basic level of empathy, which makes it easier for the abuser to convince the survivor and everyone else that abuse is not taking place. Wow, I thought that's incredible. Does that make sense to you, what she's saying? That they're faking the appearance of being supportive and invested to the public in order for us to assume that they're good people in order to take advantage of the relationship. And the final point she says is because the abuse is hidden using deception, it's difficult for survivors to recognize, understand, and escape it. This is Psych Central. If you're interested in more about this article, her proposal, she wrote it in 2018. I actually have the reference on the latest video that I just put up. I think that one of the things, why I bring this up, I think it's important for us to agree what we're all talking about, that we're not talking about other forms of abuse, even though those things are toxic and dangerous and unacceptable. But this is a forum where we're talking about narcissistic abuse. It's a unique type of abuse. It has ways in which it sort of manifests, ways in which it affects us and impacts us. And not to say that other forms aren't also highly destructive and should be stopped, but this is a place for us as survivors to come together and try to understand exactly what happened, because it's so confusing. It actually creates a mental fog that makes it extremely difficult for us to be able to feel understood, for us to be able to even have a safe. I don't know how many of you, if you're like me, have tried to share this with someone else, what's gone on, and they look at you they even cock their head and they look at you strange, and then they ask you questions like, well, then why are you staying? And you don't even know how to begin to explain that this is so complex and you're so confused you don't even know what way is up or what way is down anymore. And that they usually have you trapped. They're usually blackmailing you in some way, and it's always subtle. It's some kind of like, it's like, if the kids they'll say some threat that what it means, like, the kids will never understand, and then what they're meaning, like, and I'll make sure that they take my side, not yours. Or, they kind of have these ways of threatening us inadvertently, like dog whistling. I'm sure you guys have heard the word dog whistling. So let's see what you guys are thinking about today. What kind of questions have been on your mind? How many of us in this room have had narcissistic parents? Now, here's the thing. It's very easy for us to think anybody who's been a narcissistic abuse survivor then must come from a dysfunctional family or a troubled home. That's actually not true. That's actually a majority. Most of us have what's been called super traits. Have you heard of the big 5 personality traits? They are lack of a stable personality or lack of neuroticism. They're agreeable, They are conscientious. They tend to be more extroverted. And I'm trying to think what the last one is. Anyway, they tend to have those 5 or characteristics. And every one of us rank order somewhere on one of those various 5 qualities. And they're kind of like indicators of healthiness. Although personally, as an introvert, I don't think extroversion is healthy. I think introverts are very great as well. But anyway, I know the societal norm is for extroversions. What happens, though, is the 2 traits of agreeableness as well as conscientiousness tend to make those of us who have those as targets for those who are narcissistically abusive. When you think about it, if you were to hire somebody for a job, what would be the characteristics of someone that you'd want to hire? You'd want a good teammate, a good team player who communicates well, who gets along with other people, who sticks to the job, who's very loyal, somebody that you could rely on, right, and trust, someone who sees things out. Interestingly enough, those qualities are the very qualities that make you the prime target for an offender like this. That's what was found in a big, huge research study by Sandra Brown out of Purdue University, that it's your agreeableness, the degree that you believe in the goodness of other people, that you stick things through, that makes you more likely to be targeted. Interestingly, not necessarily those of us with a troubled parenthood or troubled childhood or necessarily have mental illness ourselves. It's more of our personality traits. It's the fact that people pleasers too, but people pleasers is actually a defensive reaction to a troubled home. People who are very eager to make sure other people are happy has lived in a dangerous situation to where it goes badly for them if everyone is not happy. And codependency, I don't know if you guys have heard me on a previous live, but codependency actually has to do with an addiction model. It's what happens to those around an addict when they're in a long-term relationship with them. They start to get ill with the addiction as they try to manage the addict's out-of-control behavior. So it really actually doesn't apply to abuse. It's better to think of this model as more a betrayal trauma model, not codependency. Codependency implies that there's explicit agreement and we get ill together, that I cooperated with your addiction or your illness and got sick with you. But what happens is, remember, narcissistic abuse is deceptiveness, manipulation. There's no cooperation. The victims who find themselves in these relationships didn't know they were getting into someone who's presenting a false reality. So there is actually cult-like programming. That's what Don Hennessy says in his book, How He Gets Into Her Head, who's a law enforcement who's worked over 30 years with domestic violence victims. He found that perpetrators actually use very sophisticated cult-like programs, to the point he actually says they're more sophisticated at enlisting us in a relationship than pedophiles are. Pedophiles. He calls them psychophiles. He has his own name. He calls them psychophiles. And he goes on, and I love this. This really rocked my world when I read it. He says in his book, How He Gets Into Her Head, that if you've been lucky enough not to fall prey to someone like this, then it's because you've not been targeted by a skilled enough offender. A skilled enough offender. In other words, these people are so good at what they do, they pretty well can manipulate about anyone if they so choose to. Isn't that wild? I was blown away when I read that, because it's so easy for us to victim blame, to say it's the fault of all of us who've met someone, that we didn't see the red flags, that we ignored the signs, that we overlooked our intuition. And I'm not saying there's not some work that we need to do to get better about some of that. I agree that, yes, there were some things that quite didn't sit right. But let me tell you, when I'm out dating, how many people do you think I meet that doesn't have any red flag at all? No one. Everyone's got something that's kind of a little off or a little odd, right? You end up asking yourself, how much can I compromise? Or is this as big as a concern as I have? And then as a result, you end up undermining yourself, and then you go with this person thinking that it's not going to be so bad. So that's why when we say to people, well, it's your fault for missing the red flags and you just need to get better at it. Here's what Don Hennessy says that I think was powerful. He says, when we point the fingers at victims, we're actually colluding with the abusers. And the reason is because at that moment, we are attacking them instead of the perpetrator, And we're also at that same time not focusing on the perpetrator who's done the damage or is doing the damage, which is what this person wants. They don't want us looking at them. They want us looking at the target, because what better way to create a distraction, right? So in fact, my ex, after this whole thing was over, we were trying to wrap up business deals, and he was being very manipulative and not cooperative. And he wrote back to me, and he again attacked me, told me what a bad victim I was, and went on and on about what a victim I was. And that's what they do. They sort of refocus the attention on the person who suffered it, instead of looking at themselves and what they did to actually facilitate it, to perpetrate it. I know you may have answered that question about, I didn't really get into about narcissistic parents, except that I know a lot of us have had that, but not everybody. And it's not necessarily a quality that makes us a victim. But can sarcasm be abusive or a narcissistic trait? Absolutely. A common weapon of narcissistic abusive people is to use jokes and sarcasm as a way to gaslight us. They'll make a very almost like a jab, like a subtle jab that's not funny, and it's attack of you that feels bad. And then when you confront them, they'll say, "Oh, I was just joking." In other words, they're saying your upsetness is inappropriate because it wasn't really meant to hurt you, that you misunderstood it. Yeah, snide comments also, I agree, is part of that. Here's an example. Yeah, they're always joking. Here's one example is I'm autistic, and one of the ways in which my autism shows up is that sometimes I'm not super coordinated. And so as a result, I'm going to tell on myself, I spill food on my clothing a lot. In fact, I've gotten very good at getting stains out. I've had to. It's in order to preserve my clothing so I don't lose all my clothes. So anyway, I confided in it with my ex that this was a problem that I had, that I really work hard to try to not have happen, and I feel very embarrassed about. And one day he walked through the bedroom and looked down at his shirt, and he had a spot of ketchup on his shirt, and he goes, I got to be careful. I'm going to become just like you. And I said, I told you that in confidence. And they said, can't you take a joke? Well, it wasn't a joke. It was something that was very, very special, very private to me. I was confiding in him, and then he turned around and he used it as a way to sort of get me. So yes, sarcasm, joking, all of that nasty stuff that's hurtful, it's a form of a microaggression. It's a way to sort of stir you up and abuse you without, then being able to own any responsibility for the abuse. So I definitely agree that joking and sarcasm can be a form of narcissistic abuse. Not with everybody, but with some people for sure. Exactly. So I'm sorry that that's happening in your life. And yeah, I'm glad you checked it out. And when they tell you that you can't take a joke, then they're gaslighting you. They're making you feel crazy for something that they're doing. They're offsetting it by blaming your reaction instead of addressing the actual offense, the hurt between the two of you. So yes, having a narcissistic parent is really rough because they make it, they use their children in the same way that they use supply. Children are supply. So children really aren't seen as full people. They're seen for what they can do. So when you grow up in a home and your first earliest relationships are narcissistic, and your attachment is therefore anxious, avoidant, or anxiously avoidant. You're going to have one of those three attachments because the person you're trying to attach with isn't secure. They're fluctuating their ability to be available. They're very highly needy. They're probably abusive. They're probably neglectful. And they're also doing tremendous level of gaslighting. They're not going to own their feelings. They're going to make you own their feelings. And they're going to really do a lot of management of their kids' emotions. They're not going to want their kids to show up and be emotionally present because they don't have the wherewithal to deal with emotions, anyone's emotions, not even the children's emotions. So they're going to ask the children to deny their emotions, certainly to avoid the toxic ones, the big ones, the difficult, they're not toxic, the big ones. They're going to not want anger or grief or anxiousness showing up in the home. There's no space for it. So as a result, what you often find is roles. Children assume roles. You have the good child or the parentified child. You'll often see a scapegoat where things are blamed and dumped on, or maybe somebody's the identified patient where they're always the problem. You might find someone who's the golden child. Well, they just sort of like can't do anything wrong. They're sort of the perfect trophy. You're going to see the child who's the lost child who just disappears. And then there might be the clown who comes in and tries to make everybody happy in order to kind of raise up the level of intensity, get rid of it because it's so brittle, so scary. They try to keep everybody laughing. What you'll also find is that these roles fluctuate. You may, for example, I was the parentified child, but I often was scapegoated a lot. So you may find kids fluctuate in and out of these roles. So it's not like you take a role for forever. Like the golden child in my family often was the lost child. So when she wasn't around and present and showing up, she was disappeared in her room, almost hiding as a way to sort of stay out of all the toxicity. Now, yes, it makes us really easygoing, and we often don't know how we're feeling. But by the way, we tend to be more insightful and introspective than our parents. We usually end up developing the skills in order to survive that they don't have. So that doesn't mean that that we're happy. It doesn't mean that we're struggling with attachments. We are struggling with attachments. So it does take healing. If you have a narcissistic parent, then I would really recommend that you find a safe place to talk about how that's affected you, how you're relating to other people. If you have children with a narcissistic ex-parent or a parent, I really highly recommend that you get support on how you're going to manage that toxic connection between the child and parent. Because here's one of the brutal rules of relationships, family relationships. Children instinctively know who's the more fragile parent. They just do. They pick up on it really fast. And they're very protective of trying to maintain a relationship with both parents. They don't want to lose either one. I mean, it makes sense. There's this connection they have with both parents. They will do whatever they can to preserve the more fragile relationship. They know that the healthier parent probably can take more, so they're going to be less supportive, less kind, less nice to the supportive parents, and harder or easier on the fragile parent. Very unfair. I know that's unfair. So that's why some of you have been cut off by your kids, or they defend the toxic parent. It's because they don't want to be forced to choose. And if either parent forces them, they're going to choose the more fragile parent. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really, really appreciate this. Bye-bye.